I wanted to talk about today is what is it we're particularly looking at in the textile space? How are we playing a role in this space? And how do we see it? And how do we come to this? Where do we think we're going in the future? Adobe is, like I said, a well-known brand. We have tools, we do stuff. People are familiar with our things. We have software for working with images, for working with graphics, for laying out pages, etc. And this tends to be the Adobe that most people know. It's the printing and publishing company. It's one of the companies that started the desktop publishing revolution in the 1980s and 90s. And we have a bunch of design tools that allow people to do design. We also have a bunch of tools that we have at Adobe that allow people to make the things that you're designing. Traditionally, people think of Adobe PostScript, again, as one of the things that kicked off that desktop publishing revolution. We did work with Steve Jobs and Apple in the early days in the idea of connecting an Apple Mac to a laser printer and later to industrial printing equipment that is used to produce books, magazines, newspapers, even today. And we've been building these sort of tools for the last 30 years, and because we have such a wide tool set, then people have been using those for a bunch of different things in different industries. No surprise, but people have been using our tools in the textile industry to design. We came to have a special look at the textile industry a few years ago. And what we realized was that while people were using our tools in this space, they were in some ways using them despite the fact that we hadn't been using them for textiles. There wasn't anything particular in the software that we were doing that made it particularly useful for textiles. But people were finding ways of using them in their workflows because they were the tools were readily available. A lot of people knew how to use them already, and they were widely accessible. So we started thinking about, well, what are the differences between the textile industry compared to the industry that we came from in our past from the publishing world. From a comparison of the ink and paper products, when we think in terms of publishing a book or a magazine or a handbill or a flyer or a brochure or something like this, we're always thinking these discrete rectangular pages. And we might bind them together in a brochure or a book like the handout you've got today about the conference. That might be what we're used to. But when we come to thinking about dye and fabrics, the problems are slightly different because we don't think about these discrete pages anymore. We're working on some sort of motif or some sort of design, which is going to be, unless we're doing an engineering print, repeated in some sort of fashion across the width of the fabric, and of course an infinite length. The idea of printing the same page over an infinite distance is not really something that exists in the publishing world. So there's a different problem there. A lot of the finishing in the paper-based world, publishing world, is fully automated. We're not there in the textile industry. There's a lot of manual work involved in actually assembling the fabric into a finished product. So we can hint at what is going to come, but actually the world of designing a textile is in that sense, very different to what we're doing with the ink and paper world. Color is completely different as well. When we're working in publishing, we think of in terms of an unlimited color palette. One of the problems, now we say unlimited, and I put that in air quotes because in reality it's not really unlimited, but we think about the idea we can use freely any color and we can get some sort of reproduction, and we can think in terms of black and white or color, but generally we pick a color on the screen and we think we can print it. That's not necessarily the same in the textile world. There's another huge problem we have here is that we can't spell the word color consistently, and sometimes we spell it with a U and other times we spell it without a U. That's somewhat aside. But when we think about color for the publishing industry, we want to reproduce a large number of colors very accurately. If you think about how you see the reproduction of a photograph, for example, in a magazine or in a book, it jars the eye if you don't get all the colors right relative to each other, and let's say the blue sky was sort of a shade of green rather than blue. That's going to be jarring. When we work in terms of a textile industry, we tend to think in terms of a smaller number of colors. We think in terms of a colorway or a palette. And while we don't need to reproduce at this second for this job, 16 billion colors accurately, those small set of colors that we are printing on fabric, we want to make sure they're right. We want to make sure that they're consistent, maybe from one roll to the next, or if we're printing the same color on one fabric and we're printing it let's say, on a different type of fabric the next day, we want those to be consistent across processes. And this is another problem when it comes to thinking about digital printing versus maybe the rotary or the flat screen printing. We'd ideally like those colors to be consistent from one process to the other as well, particularly given that, as we said earlier, the digital printing at the moment is only 6% growing in the market. The idea of having consistent color from one mechanism to the next is hugely important. We think we've solved this for the ink on paper market, but it's still something we're struggling with somewhat in the textile space. And the last thing, I kind of alluded to this a second ago as well. When we're printing on paper, we have industry standards for the types of paper we'll be printing on. And we can say, we'll be printing on ISO mumble paper, and we know exactly the conditions that we'll be printing on with a defined set of inks. We don't have that in the textile space. And we can't persuade, the silkworm to spin exactly the same type of silk this week as it did last week. All right, we're particularly when we're working with natural fibers. If we're working with man-made fibers, okay, maybe we get a bit more control over the process because it's man-made and we can have quality control, etc. But when we're using natural fibers, the fact that these are natural and will vary is going to cause another problem which we have to be able to cope with. So these are some of the differences that we identified when we started looking. My role at Adobe is to be part of the printing organization. So when I had this previous slide and I talked about how we do these creative applications and when we do the manufacturing stuff, I come more from the manufacturing end of the workflow. Okay. So we looked at all these problems and we said, okay, well, maybe we should try and look at how we can help the industry to move forward and address some of these issues. And we were thinking that we were going to start off at the manufacturing end. What we discovered very quickly when we talked to people is that, well, we could do that, but we're having some problems with our creative and design tools too. Can you fix those? So that got us thinking, and perhaps we should be doing something there. And when we were looking at this, we had to think of the problem and trying to understand how are people using software today when they're creating prints, when they're creating their designs. And there's a relatively straightforward workflow, which pretty much everybody's using. Kathy alluded to this earlier. You start off with some piece of artwork, which has come from somewhere. Very often, the designers are still using, I'll call them natural media, as opposed to digital media, right? They are using charcoals, or they're painting with watercolors, or they're sketching, or something is happening, or maybe we have an archival print that we want to use, which needs capturing in some way. And so we start off a process with scanning that into the computer so we can digitize it. There are people, of course, who design digitally and they start off by drawing in Illustrator, or they use Photoshop or tools like this. When they're doing that, they're very often emulating that natural design process. They're using special brushes and they want to use wash effects in those applications, etc. So although you end up with a digital file, it's not that dissimilar to what you might end up with if you've done the work by hand and scanned. And at the end of the day, this is an artisanal process, all right? People want something which is going to be appealing. They don't want something that looks like, I was going to say Minecraft, but actually you do want clothing that's got Minecraft prints on it today, but we digress. But we start off with some sort of scan, and the general process is that you get your scan, and when you use the computer, you use software, you generate some sort of repeating pattern, and there are different tools available to do this. It might take you a certain amount of time. You create some sort of repeat from that scan. You start thinking about, and this is if you're a practitioner, the idea of color indexing, because before we had the world of digital printing where we could print any color, we need to reduce the number of colors down to a limited set. And even in the world of, frankly, of digital manufacture, we're still seeing a lot of people interested in this idea of reducing the number of colors, because once you start reducing the number of colors to a relatively small set, you can start thinking about, swapping some of them out and making an alternate. Right? We have multiple colorways from a single print, for example, and it's really easy to do that. If you've already reduced the number of colors to a base set, you can make those substitutions. So you kind of do that, and at the end of the day, you've got a finished process. Finished print, you've got a finished result, you can go away and print that in a large volume. So that sounds good. Does anybody in the room actually do this on a regular basis? Show of hands. All right, so we'll see. NC State people put their hands up, that's good. So this sounds easy, right? This is the simplified version. Realistically, it's kind of a little bit more complicated than that, all right? It sounds like you could do it in 2 minutes, but the reality is, okay, you start with your scan and you have to find something that's big enough to scan your 42-inch, 54-inch bit of fabric, okay. You get it into the computer. You're probably going to use Photoshop to clean up that scan. There's probably a bunch of things you have to do. You probably have to go round and round a few circles to get that right and pass it around. And what resolution did you scan at? And can you get rid of some of the artifacts? You need to remove if you're scanning a piece of fabric, maybe you need to remove the stitches effect from that as well to clean up the image. So there's a bunch of work you do in Photoshop to clean up a scan. And then you can start thinking about isolating the individual parts of the scan to make a print. Well, that's great. If you're building a repeat, then you start off with something in the middle of a square tile. And the idea is you're going to take this repeat, or based on your square tile, and you're going to repeat it some way across a particular, to get it to print repeatedly across a piece of fabric, you'll need to do things, because as you start thinking about looking at this repeat, you need some sort of preview to show you, well, okay, well, I built this, took out this one berry. What does that look like if I were to repeat that berry over a large area? So you'll have some sort of preview, which is a process you'll go through. And as you refine your pattern, you'll start thinking, okay, well, I'd like to move that berry up to the top and bottom of my rectangle. So you have to work out, well, I'll break it in half and I'll move the bottom half up to the top and the top half down to the bottom, something like that. And then if I place that onto my square, that will repeat nicely as we print it over a large area. Well, that's easy. If I want to push something to a corner, then I'll do something else. I'll break it into 4. We'll split it up. We'll swap those two around. We'll swap those two around. And again, I could tile this larger rectangle over a large area and get a repeat. And all the time you're thinking, well, how do you preview this? How do you check it? Do you have to use extra steps to do that preview? Okay, eventually you'll get to the stage where you have managed to find out what this repeating thing might look like. Okay, that's fine. You're probably saving your work as you go, because that act of cutting the raspberry into 4 was somewhat tedious, and you might break something as you go along, so you'll save. Version A, version B, version C, version D. Okay, so now you start indexing, and you start reducing the number of colors that you have in your design. This is fun. Oh, and as you go, you want to preview regularly as well, so you get an idea of how this is going to look in its final repeat. And you might start off with reducing the number of colors down from 16 billion that you can have in an RGB file down to a smaller number. Now, some people will start high and go low, so you might start with a number like 16. But it's very expensive if you are doing an analog print to actually engrave 16 rollers. That would be a very, very expensive piece of fabric. So you probably want to go lower than 16. And I'll make a comment here about the digital and the rotary or screen process. When we're talking to designers, it would be very easy for us to build software which only work for digital printing, for digital output. But when you speak to a lot of the brands and you talk to people about how they're going to use their design, the artist, the person who's doing this work, they say, well, I don't know if this is going to be printed analog or digital. Statistically, there's a 94% chance it's going to be printed analog and a 6% chance it's going to be printed digital. So I don't want to do anything in my design stage which is going to force, necessarily, this to be printed one particular way, because I need to be able to sell this print, this design I'm making, and use any type of process. And this is an important thing as well. If we're designing for digital, the question is always in the back of the designer's minds, well, what if this has to be printed analog? And it needs to look the same. So part of the process is making sure you've got a design which could be manufactured either way, because we don't know yet. Okay. You might start with 16, and if you look, and maybe that would be a bit expensive, but this is part of a process, so you'll reduce the number of colors down from 16, and if you look very carefully, we'll go to 8 colors, and the colors shift a little bit if you've only got 8 dyes available, but you could do something. Well, that's still a little bit expensive. Maybe we want to go down a bit further. Let's go to 6. It's changing a bit more. We're going to go a bit further. Can we go to 4? Maybe I don't like this very much. I need to go back. Oh, and here's another problem. All right. When you use a tool like Photoshop and you're doing this, when you're reducing the number of colors, you're throwing away colors, all right? And you need to go back to something, and we need to go back to, we don't want to use 4, we want to use 8. Well, you better make sure you save the 8 color version, because if you didn't save the 8 color version, then you're going to have you're going to have trouble going back to it. So, okay, so you do that, and eventually you decide how many colors you want to have in your index. And all the time, you want to be able to see how this looks in repeat, right, in the final form. So that's great. So you get a bit further, and now we're going to start applying colors, and the same thing goes on here as well. You want to pick the colors you want to swap out. You want to preview everything as you go along. What's that going to look like? You want to make one substitution for another. Eventually, you might make more changes, and hopefully, at the end of the day, you'll end up with some nice colors that you've selected, which has the visual appearance that you want for an alternate colorway, maybe, and eventually you end up here. If you're a practitioner in the room, hopefully that sounds vaguely familiar, and this sounds painful, and there are people nodding their heads. Okay, I'll take that as good. This can be quite time-consuming, and it's not particularly easy. This is why you get paid the big bucks if you come to NC State and you learn how to do this, right? Because this is a complicated process. What happens, though, when you've done all this work and you've gone through all these steps? I mean, somebody comes in the room and says, "Oh, Mike, you've created this beautiful design, but actually you've basically just created a basic grid repeat here. I would much have preferred a half drop. Could you do that instead?" Or were you have a customer? Yes. I'll go back to the version I started and saved last Tuesday afternoon, and I'll change my repeat. And I'll have to go back and redo all that work, because actually, remember that going back and doing this, breaking it down into quadrants and all that sort of thing, I had to redo that because instead of, and you imagine how slow it is going back in PowerPoint to do this, imagine how much slower it is to do it in real life, right? So you have to go back, which version did I do? Okay, and I'll have to redo all that. I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, go back here. Right, now instead of doing quadrants, I've got to calculate what the math's going to be to have a berry halfway down on the left-hand side and all this sort of thing, right? So you have to go back and redo all that work. Oh, and if you've done all that indexing thing, you're going to have to do that over again, all right? Because the work you did to change that repeat is threw information away. Once you index, we have this concept in Photoshop and all our creative tools about having layers, so you can have all these different motifs discrete and move them around relative to each other. Praise be to Adobe, as soon as you start doing color indexing, it throws all that information away. And you have to do it all over again. So, all right. But you can do it. So, I now have to go redo all the work and go forwards again. Oh, and if you substituted colors along the process as well, because we're going to have blueberries. I think we call them blackberries, actually, where I come from, even though they're blue. Don't worry. You have to redo all that work, and it's very, very, very time-consuming. So, this is what people came to us and said, you know, Adobe, you haven't really done anything for us in the last 10, 15 years. What could you do for us? So we went away, and we had to think about it, and we thought, maybe there's something we could do. So, thanks to Dr. Lisa for the tease, WTiN is fortunate to be the world premiere. You are the first guys to hear about this publicly outside of a non-disclosure of Adobe Textile Designer. Oh, you don't have to clap, don't worry. That's very Jed Bush, and the Americans will get that. We wanted to go away and reimagine how people were doing this, all right, and see if we could make it easier. And yes, there are people who are struggling with our tools and making this happen today. There are some tools available from other companies, and a couple of those have been mentioned today as well, that you can go and you can use, and some people are extremely expert and trained in those tools, and they spend a lot of time investing in very expensive software to do it. But we thought, well, people are struggling to do this with our tools, maybe we can help them make it easier. So we're announcing this actually next week. So the timing is, this is how WTiN get the exclusive, is because this isn't actually going to go live until next week. We've been talking about a little project privately in some audiences. You may have heard reference to a product called Project Paris, which was the predecessor for this. But basically, it's the idea of taking our software and making it more useful for textile designers to do the stuff that they want to do on a very, very regular basis. The premise and you'll get a chance to see this afternoon in the workshops, the premise is that we want to try and keep the designer designing, try and keep them creative. All that rework that we talked about in the previous slides, we want to get rid of that. So if you want to make a simple change, like changing a repeat, click that button, there we go. Like changing a repeat, and you want to change from a grid to a half drop, then you should be able to do that at any time in your design process. Not necessarily at the beginning, but at any time within the design process, you should be able to make that change, right? All these things should remain live at all times. So we added a bunch of features to make creating and the preview of your repeats super easy. Did a bunch of work there. We've tried to do a lot of work to make the process of reducing this design from 16 billion colors down to something which is manageable much easier. This is something on the screen which kind of shows how we're doing that, and you can see how the ground color actually has been separated out, and we can work with the ground independently of the other colors or any of the other colors we have in the design. So we've got ways of working with that. Again, live within Photoshop. All right, so at this point, you could still go around and make changes. You want to move those apples around or change the grid, you could still do that, even though we've separated, even though effectively we're color indexed. All right, so that's something which is people were asked for. The other thing that people were asking us for is, okay, we're going to use a particular dyes. I work with a particular dye manufacturer to decide the dyes that I'll be using for manufacture, or I'm a brand. All right, and I have a palette that I'm using for my upcoming collection. Right, in 2020, I'm going to use something from this palette of 800 colors, or 400 colors, or 200 colors, or 20 colors. All right, so we wanted to make sure that the software allowed you to work with that. And if you have your own set of either preferred dyes, or you have your in-brand colors, or you're working on a particular set of colorways that you have for a particular collection, the idea that you can bring this into the software and see exactly on screen how this will look when it's manufactured. So remember this original screen here. On the left, you're seeing the original RGB design that came off the scanner and in all its glory. But on the right-hand side, you're seeing exactly what this is going to look like in the exact color from the dyes that you've selected from your dye set. But it's all still live, so you can still move stuff around. All right. So that was quite exciting. And then if you come for the demonstration this afternoon, we'll see how that ties in to the conversations that Flint and Kerry are going to have to follow up from me. There'll be a nice segue there to see how you could use this tool to see how the colors would look if you were to print it at Spoonflower or Weave Up. Or you can imagine, I'm brand X, I could see it with my brand X colors. And of course, once you want to start seeing these colors, then the ability to have multiple colorways, and if anybody's heard about Project Paris or seen any of that stuff we did in the past, brand new in Adobe Textile Designer is the ability to work with multiple colorways simultaneously. So you want to do a red apples on a light background, or you want to do green apples on a dark background, you could define that within the software, and everything is still live. You want to add another extra apple, move stuff around, change it from a basic to a drop, for example. All this work is still live and redoable. And of course, the end of the process as well is, exporting off to production. So it doesn't matter, which of the colorways that you decided, or all of the colorways that you wanted to have in your final design. Click. We need to make sure that we're putting the information in the files that we're exporting to production, so that when you get to manufacturing, then the colors that you're going to see on the screen are going to match exactly what comes out of the printer. So we're putting information in the files which can be used by manufacturing later to make sure we get that end-to-end consistency that's important. And that's going to be important whether or not we're printing using screens or whether we're printing digitally, right? It's going to be tough, and I will be the first to say that we're introducing this product this next week. We are calling it a public beta, which means that it might not work 100% of the time, but at the same time, we're not charging you for it, so please go away, play with it. It is available come next Monday at that top URL. You can take pictures, but hopefully this will be in the slides when they come out next week. This site will go live on Monday If you can't wait, that URL at the bottom is live today. Like I said, we've been doing a public beta for about 6 months now. The usage has exceeded our expectations. You know, we thought we might get a few hundred people interested in this. We got several thousand instead, so that was exciting. But that's one of the reasons that we decided that we could actually, you know, there was sufficient interest in this product and we could take it to the next stage. And that's what we're doing next week. Okay. Like I said, this is a sneak peek that you guys are getting today. None of you signed a non-disclosure as you came in, which means you're free to talk about it. So everything I've said today is in the public domain. So, okay, my marketing team are going to know I'm doing it. So I have this with the blessing of corporate marketing. But we're going to be doing this for real at a couple of shows coming up in Europe. Some of these will be familiar to you. If you're there, look us up. I'd like to say hi.